JBL proudly presents Guitar Center Sessions.
Kickstand. was just a lie to burning wind. Saw it in the sky, thought it was the end, thought it was the 4th of July.
good. We're here with Chris, Kim, Ben, and Matt, Soundgarden. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Hey. Thank you so much. 25 years, I guess. It's a long time, a lot of music, and we want to talk about it all. But first up, maybe I can ask you one at a time, what do you think it is about Soundgarden's music that stands the test of time?
Fans.
It's black magic. Yeah. I don't know. I think that's one of those questions where I don't really ever want to look too deeply into what I imagine the answer might be, because it just seems like that could interfere with writing the next song or making the next album or whatever reason it is. It seems to me that I believe that the music does, so we don't have a problem to solve. So let's not try to solve it, and then hopefully it'll keep happening.
Let's talk about the direction of music that was going on in the early 90s, mid-90s, when you guys were first coming up. What was going on around you?
Well, in the mid-90s, we were over a decade old, so we had been around, and we had kind of, as a band, had underwent several transformations already musically. The first, we wrote, I'm sure, more than an album's worth of material in a few weeks of being a band that ended up kind of being abandoned for newer material, and that process happened several times.
Right.
To me, the strength and kind of what I felt like was this incubating important Seattle scene happened before anyone else knew about it. Say by the time Superunknown came out in the mid-90s, that scene didn't exist anymore, really. Most of the bands that were the core of it, or members of those bands, were all out touring internationally, or they were in the studio making albums, or producing someone else's album, which could be in Seattle or somewhere else. And a lot of our producer friends were ending up going to the Netherlands or Australia or all these other places. So that scene was gone. And what was happening kind of was that this decade of us being a band and figuring out what we wanted to do and what band we wanted to be suddenly had helped create a situation where popular rock music kind of moved towards what we did, which was I don't think it was something that we expected necessarily, and it was an interesting moment.
What was going on around Seattle? Were other musicians supportive of each other?
Yes,
was there a camaraderie?
Definitely
Seattle was
camaraderie.
always like that.
And it was definitely cooperative. Our audience consisted of members of other bands, artists, photographers, students, producers. A lot of the people we worked with in our early days also, are also associated with bands like Green River, Mudhoney, Nirvana.
That town is a very do-it-yourself town, and everybody supports each other doing it's stuff. Like the students that were there were soon to be doctors and whatever, or architects or students at those shows, and the bands that were going to pursue. Everyone in that town, even to this day, is a do-it-yourself town where you have to get it done yourself because no one else is going to do it for you.
That's an important point because many bands didn't perform in Seattle. It was kind of out of the way, so they would just skip. The bands that did come to Seattle were
in the 90s,
these bands on SST, like Black Flag, the Minutemen, the Meat Puppets. Those guys would make the extra trip and go out of their way and go play Portland, play Seattle. And the kids there, we all appreciated that. We loved these bands and sort of followed in kind, stylistically, the kind of DIY ethos that Ben was pointing out. God, those are great times.
I think like in the 80s, we looked up to those bands that Kim just mentioned as a model of success because they were touring nationally and internationally.
And Matt just came back from seeing Off this afternoon.
Yeah, that's right. And they set up, they kind of trailblazed this sort of underground rock movement that we wanted to be a part of. So I think our examples early on it was that as opposed to, maybe some of the arena rock groups that we grew up with, we didn't really, that wasn't as attainable as getting in a van with a U-Haul and going out there and doing it. So.
Thing that happens when you combine, especially your voice, your guitar, and the rhythm section, obviously. I mean, that is something that is uniquely Soundgarden. The influences come together there, obviously. Did you work on developing that tone?
There was no model or intent that we were trying to recreate or establish for ourselves. Perhaps our peers had maybe a little bit of that rubbed off. You know, when you come back from seeing a great band who are friends of yours, you might go to practice and try to figure out what they were doing. But that was happening in the other direction as well. Our influence was just spread locally amongst our peers pretty heavily.
Yeah, I always felt too that and think about it even now, that whatever our musical identity is, what you would consider to be a sound, it has to be somewhat of a combination of each of our individual sensibilities, and then we each individually have sort of a perception of what Soundgarden should sound like. All four of us are always kind of trying to push the boundaries of what that is individually, which ends up being an even bigger push collectively. And then I've always looked at, like I would always say that Kim's probably my biggest influence as a guitar player. I started learning how to play guitar after Soundgarden formed, just to contribute songs. Even if sometimes I'll be writing vocal melodies or phrasing, and Ben has influenced me as a songwriter and a singer and a lyricist in ways like that. Matt has influenced me in that way as well. Rhythmically, all three of them, because they all have completely different sensibilities rhythmically than me, and I somewhere, I suppose, in the subconscious, I have an idea of what that all adds up to be. But it's this weird, living, organic, breathing thing, and it's also so. There's so many possibilities within it that this interview will end, and then I'll think of like 50 other aspects about our band that I've never thought about before that I might steer into next time I try to write a song. It's an interesting and organic thing, and I think it's also it's something that you get when you don't have like one sort of egocentric kind of captain of the band that writes all the music and all the lyrics and decides what everyone should wear and that kind of thing. I think Soundgarden represents, and has since we formed, a band where we are larger than the sum of its parts, and you know, it's the combination that makes us what we are. Therefore, it's really difficult to define. And I also have always thought of us as being kind of the opposite, sort of the opposite of AC/DC, or even the Ramones. You know, where they're a band that were fully formed musically and artistically really early on, knew what they wanted to look like, knew what they wanted to sound like, knew what they liked about music, and said, this is what we do and this is what we're going to do and you can count on us. And we're the opposite. We're like, we want to always be reaching and always be discovering new
Stretching
things.
out.
And
We are a little bit more self-conscious and insecure, so I guess we're always trying to figure out how we fit in within ourselves as well as with other people.
Talk about that a little bit more.
I think I kind of referenced that a little bit earlier by saying we're not particularly social music. If we were, we'd write more songs than 4/4 so you can dance, you know. But that is particularly what I want to do, so why would I want to compel other people to do that?
You mentioned you've been around a little while by the time you got to Superunknown. Where were you guys at as you were recording that record? Because that changed everything. Were you in a place where you knew that was going to happen?
I think we've just been continuously working since
The juggernaut had started.
'87. You know, we'd been touring, making records, just doing it all, and we had really great opportunities to continue. And it seems like we were getting better offers, and you know, we signed to A&M Records in what 88 or 89 or something.
We're growing fairly slowly but steadily.
I think like you know, when Ben joined the band, we had like so much more songwriting potential that this record before that, Bad Motorfinger, really I think highlighted the different aspects of the songwriting combinations. So by the time we got to Superunknown, I felt like creatively we were kind of peaking at that point. We were playing really instinctively together, kind of telepathically, and we were able to sort of reach this level that you know, I don't know, it sort of became second nature, but it was also really satisfying to us as songwriters and musicians to have everything sort of culminate with that record. But you know, we also got bigger time producer, and we were in a bigger studio.
Exactly.
So I think there was a focus to try to pinpoint, certain sonic things that we hadn't had on our previous records and things like that. But as far as the songwriting and the music goes, it was just all part of this arc that we were on.
There were a number of singles off that record, and the first one, Spoonman, won a Grammy for Best Metal
Performance.
Strange.
Well, that's what I was going to ask
Grammy.
you. You get a Grammy for Best Metal Performance.
Silver for Spoons.
Prior to that, the things that were being referred to as metal were it's kind of pop music with fuzzy guitars and hair dye. So it's a lot of things were being considered metal that was really children's music. So who knows?
I think in a way it fits though, in terms of what the perception of metal is, for example. And I think it is what you think it is. It is what you say it is. It's hard rock, I guess. And then metal became a genre, like alternative, which was a word to describe what wasn't getting played on mainstream radio, actually became a genre with rules and predominant sounds and things you couldn't do. But we were one of the only bands, for example, that got played on 120 Minutes, which was an MTV indie show, and Headbangers Ball, which was a metal show. We were one of the first indie bands to get commercial rock radio airplay in different cities, including
and a Grammy
Los
nomination.
Angeles.
Ultra Mega OK on SST was nominated for a Grammy, which is
which was kind of unusual.
I think at the time, though, music fans were much more divided into liking a particular style of music.
And they're really strident about it, too.
That's how they wanted to market everything.
But
they
also,
didn't want you to know that Phil Lynott hung out with the Sex Pistols. They wanted to make rock this, punk that.
Sure.
Because they figured they could sell it easier.
It's easier to market.
Separating things.
But if you listen to
it's kind of odd to polarize these two things. They're all pretty much listened to by young white men.
But if you listen to metal music, you are probably not listening to pop music, something like that. Whereas Black Hole Sun came along and crossed all those barriers. That was mainstream success for you.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that that come to mind out of it. First of all, MTV played a key role in that. Back when MTV played music. And I'm also wondering, did MTV drive radio?
I think that, I was told during that period by people that had like their names on parking spots that would change. It depended literally on the week. If there was suddenly a song blowing up at radio that MTV didn't support yet, but it was blowing up at radio, they would play the video. It didn't matter what it was. And then if MTV somehow got a huge reaction from a video and radio had never heard of them, radio would follow MTV. But what I do know is, however it got on to television, that had a huge impact, particularly on Seattle rock bands, because suddenly you're getting 15 to 20 spins a day of your video on a television station that exists worldwide, and everyone in every country that has MTV is now seeing that video all at the same time. It wasn't like say when the Beatles hit, they hit different markets, and it took a long, it took a couple of years for the whole world to go, oh, the Beatles? With MTV, that didn't. With Smells Like Teen Spirit, that happened in a week. Same thing with Welcome to the Jungle. It was immediate. And I think that has a lot to do with the size of these record sales. For an album to sell 5 or 10 million, couldn't have happened without the fact that album had its own TV show.
Of course, you also got lumped in with grunge because of the fact that you were from Seattle, and every band that could play in Seattle was getting signed at the time. I mean, that was a time, I guess, where everything did change, and grunge became the mainstream, alternative became the mainstream. But when you look back at that now, and you look at that time, how do you feel about that, being thrown in with that? Is that okay? Is it strange?
It was strange for us because when we started, we were, as Kim says, pretty insular, and we were also encouraged by each other and our fans that we were a band that was going to reach a bigger audience. We were always told that. I was told that from the very beginning of the band, and it seemed to slowly but surely happen, no matter what we did. But it was a slow but sure process. It wasn't anything that was ever going to be an overnight success. And then to feel that autonomy turn into being part of something else. The only thing I didn't like about that was I didn't like the idea that the perception would be that the spotlight is on not just Soundgarden but all of us because of what we mean collectively as a flavor of the moment, as a geography of the moment that's fun to talk about. Now there's a bunch of bands out of this little previously untalked about provincial place. And that was the only thing that bothered me. We obviously loved the other bands and the people in them and were happy for everyone's success and were proud to be a part of it. But I also didn't want to be a part of it because I wanted us to just be us.
Yeah, you didn't necessarily want to rise or sink with that ship.
No,
that's why I didn't really worry myself, because I knew it would be, we're our own thing anyway, regardless. And I would get my panties in a bundle more than any of these guys and talk shit about everybody.
Probably.
Especially that word grunge. And I think it's hilarious.
I think Superunknown was a big factor in a sense freeing us from that, because it wasn't like and nor could it be compared to anything from Seattle or anywhere else. And I didn't think that we ever really had to worry about it then. And I also think that the other Seattle bands around that period of time were doing the same thing. They were kind of defining who they were on other levels that separated them from us. And the truth of the matter really is there's no such thing as grunge. It was just kind of invented and as a label to put on it to make it easier to market.
Yeah, sure.
And at this point, it's probably a great thing that we're considered that, because it's also considered to be like the last vital movement in the history of rock music, really.
It sounds like you had such a diverse audience by now from what we were talking about earlier. Did you guys, even if the label wasn't getting in the way or putting any pressure on, did you feel any pressure from each other on yourselves?
I think we always probably put pressure on ourselves. I think that's just our nature, and I think it's it's not I think it's also a band where everybody's very supportive and accepting. I mean, I was a drummer when we started out, and I was learning to play guitar and contributing ideas to the band to a guitar player and a bass player who were accepting them, and interested and happy about it.
Yeah.
But I also think that we're all tough critics on ourselves individually and on what ends up being music for the band. That's why the role of a producer becomes sort of redundant, because if the four of us like the way something sounds or like a song arrangement or like an idea, we don't need a fifth Beatle. I think that slows the process down and could maybe corrupt something that I don't think is a good idea to corrupt.
Dan, on the upside, continued your success, more platinum album sales and big tours, and then you broke up. Why?
Not selling enough records, I guess.
Yeah. I think we had that kind of has mostly to do with the fact that it was, though it seems like a weird time for a band to split up, we'd been a band since 1984. And it wasn't until the early 90s that we had reached a large audience. So it was fairly recent that the audience in the size that we had even knew about us. But it wasn't fairly recent that we were a band making records, recording and touring, and also there was a transition from being an indie band where virtually everything was done based on what the four of us decided we wanted to do and how we did it, even to being our own roadies, to then having a periphery of people needing to meet schedules, make decisions. And some of that is just the nature of how things are when your audience expands and you sell more records, and some of it was just the fat of a stupid industry that is now dead because of it.
So was there a level of disenchantment with what you had gotten yourselves into? And the follow-up to that is, when you decided to stop, did you think that was it? Or was it like, let's just take some time and we'll see what happens?
There was I wouldn't say disenchantment, but it just, like, in other words, there wasn't some sort of a philosophical conflict. It was more of a day-to-day life becomes less enjoyable. And I also think that because of what we had created, for me, there's like this preservationist attitude towards it. Like, if this is going to be icky, then let's just not do it, because up to that point, we hadn't done anything. We hadn't made any mistakes with our music. We hadn't made any mistakes in front of our fans. We hadn't done anything that we weren't
hadn't made
proud
any
of.
mistakes friendship-wise or relationship-wise. We were all really good friends still. So there was no story why we broke up.
Well, you've obviously gone off, all of you, and done separate things and had other careers, I guess, outside of Soundgarden. But 12 years later, you decide to come back. What was the motivation? What was the spark?
T-shirts for kids.
Yeah, there were some aspects of our partnership that wasn't being addressed. Things like merchandise, e-commerce. We didn't have a website. It just seemed weird.
And then we might as well do the coolest part of the whole gig and play music together.
So was it really about coming back and taking care of the business side of things?
Yeah,
there were
business meetings.
We actually owned a building together and some other stuff, but mostly we owned our interest in the band, which was just stagnant. We have friends who have kids who are learning to play instruments themselves, and they say, I took my son or my daughter to the store and got her a guitar. She was checking out records and T-shirts. I noticed that there were no Soundgarden T-shirts. It's like, oh crap, you're right. There are no Soundgarden posters. Where can I get them? I don't know.
Yeah.
We should start paying attention to this.
About King Animal, obviously, that's the 6th Soundgarden album.
Yeah. I'd say 7th.
Kim will challenge you and say 7.
Yeah, if you include a live album?
It's a mistake that it's been referred to as a 6th, or that we had 5 records prior to that, because we just re-released in November our first album, which was Screaming Life from the Sub Pop label. We did a couple EPs in the Sub Pop label.
Now, is that because you got the stuff back?
Yeah, well, there's a few legal and financial outstanding issues that hadn't been resolved. Also, during this period of inactivity, where our catalog and merchandise was neglected, it was one of the things we wanted to address. We addressed it. The record finally came out. Yay, go team. That's our first album, and then Ultra Mega OK on SST, and then from there we made 4 albums on A&M, and now King Animal, our 7th.
So your 7th album, King Animal.
Yes.
The disco record.
And I think it's definitely important that's known, since we just re-released the first one.
Absolutely.
Screaming Life, Sub Pop. Go check it out.
Big time difference in between those albums, obviously. And if we look at the songs on this album, was there any different approach to writing?
No, it's just kind of the same mishmash, whatever. There's some complete authorship. There's various collaborations. There's this spontaneous jams at rehearsal that generate ideas. I guess the important thing is the idea, not where it originated from.
I remember going into it totally stoked to hear what these guys were going to bring in. It's like, right on, Matt's bringing in a song. Yeah, let's do it.
Watching how they develop is different.
Exactly.
But is there anything new? Is there anything that you left out?
Tons.
You mean material? Songs?
From the sound of the band and the way you record, the way you write, the way
The horn sections are missing now.
I was never hammered. I was never super drunk during
we
any of
weren't
it.
drinking and getting all screwed up all the time.
Yeah, not until we were done.
I think that the process was pretty much the same, though. Once we did get in the studio, we didn't necessarily change it too much the way that we had always made records. The technology the technology was different, with all the Pro Tools and things like that. But our approach was pretty much the same.
I think the pre-production part was really fun too this time. So we were at Pearl Jam's warehouse.
That's true.
And Kim's guitar tech,
Josh was recording
Josh Evans,
everything we were
recorded
doing.
everything.
It was great.
So it was really fun, and it
he-
was just really relaxed. It was us 4 guys and Josh.
And he noted everything that was done.
Yeah, he's hyper
so that we could
organized,
reference
totally
it later.
cool.
It was great. It was really facilitated the whole process.
Yeah, we'd never done anything
What
like
was that thing we did last week? That was
We kind of did that with Bad Motor Finger and stuff, and Stuart would be in Josh's thing.
Right. Stuart Hallerman.
But he was running his studio, so it was more like a weird disconnect between him and us.
That was a vast recording company in Seattle.
So when you look at
plug.
where you're at now, is this
Josh Evans rules, man.
a continuation or is it a second act?
It kind of feels like a continuation, I guess. But
What?
I guess it's also a second. I don't know.
Well, just decide and then tell the nice man.
Second act.
Are we taking a vote?
You are.
It just kind of picked up where we left off. So, I think maybe a continuation. It could be either. It doesn't matter. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's
Kim's got
depends
a
on the
guitar
day.
today. He's got to break it.
I think in some ways it's probably a second act. In a lot of ways, it feels like a continuation that would have, where the defining factor is just like how we announced it. We've broken up. Had we not said that, then it would have just been a continuation. But also, 12 years, which turned into 15 between albums, didn't feel like that long a time to me. It felt like less.
You know that thing that Luke Skywalker used to fly around in the first Star Wars? That hovercraft or whatever?
Yeah.
Soundgarden, to me, it seems like we stashed that machine. And now we've found it again.
You just
And
jump
it's
back on?
Yeah, and it runs the same, and we can either modify it or whatever we want.
That's
But
so-
we've preserved the legacy and the band in a certain spot, and now we're back to it, and we can do whatever with it.
Just hovering around the world.
Yeah.
Well, it's so great talking to you guys. Thank you for sharing a little bit of the history, your process, and obviously catching us up with what's going on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for being
Thank
a
you
nice
so
man
much.
asking questions.
That does it for another episode of Guitar Center Sessions. My thanks to our guest, Soundgarden. I'm Nick Harcourt. Until the next time, thanks for watching.